I'll give you a little bit of history about my journey in research ethics, define what research misconduct is, and then give you basically a series of vignettes and my opinion on where the field is heading. And actually, it's hard to say that scientific misconduct is a field, but it's become a bit of a I don't know, a cottage industry of folks doing this professionally. And, I mean, I've co-written with a bioethicist in the NIH before. I mean, that's all this guy does is misconduct and ethics sorts of things. So when I was a PhD student, somehow, and I still can't remember exactly how or why, but I got appointed as the Chief Justice of our graduate honor system at Virginia Tech. So that means I chaired a panel that heard misconduct allegations. And then I promptly forgot about all that stuff until it's been a number of years ago now when my own student, one of my own students, former student, because I asked him to move on after that, ended up plagiarizing in a class and actually plagiarizing some of my own, work. And so, and I mean, so, between 1993 and I'm going to say about 2006 or 2007, I was quite insulated. This is a glass insulator. I rode my bicycle here, and so as I was getting ready to go out the door, one of my students said, here's a little present for you, because I know you like these things, and it came from New Mexico. It's like, well, I don't have one from New Mexico. So I rode with it in my backpack. I figured I might as well display it because it was kind of heavy. But I felt it pretty insulated from misconduct. And then when it hit close to home, I started asking questions. Am I talking about research ethics and misconduct enough to my own lab folks? Because he told me that he thought it was, he didn't understand really why this plagiarism was an issue, and he thought it was that he was complimenting me by copying my stuff. And so I did that, started teaching a class. I'll talk about the class just a little bit, and ended up writing a book to support the class. And so here we are today. And I think about this, a lot. So basically, the Office of Research Integrity has 3 sanctionable offenses: plagiarism, falsification, and fabrication. And these are some good definitions of these terms. So most everybody actually has a good idea about what plagiarism is. At least you would think so. Since I've been doing a lot of editorial stuff, and I recently confronted, this is kind of another kind of hearkening back to 2006 or whenever it was about my student. I got a paper, and there was some plagiarism where they were copying and pasting some of their earlier works, right? So it was self-plagiarism. Once again, it was a group in another country. I think it was someplace in Europe, and they said, well, we didn't know there was anything wrong with this. Okay, so once again, the education part. And this is probably, and I think the data support that plagiarism is the most frequent sanctionable offense reported, okay? Then there's falsification. Falsification is, sorry, from the bottom here. Falsification is manipulating research materials or research subjects, equipment. So this is it can be pretty broad, right? So it's basically not telling the truth about a study. Okay, that's falsification. Fabrication is probably the worst, right? I mean, most people would think that's the worst. Just making up data and saying that something happened when in fact it didn't happen, right? And so you can say, and if you want to grade these, you would say, okay, this one's fraudulent, right? Fabrication's fraudulent. I mean, There'd be no doubt. Falsification, maybe some of this and some of this can be done accidentally. Maybe. Okay? If anyone has any questions, please interrupt. And we'll stop, get some questions answered, and then move on. But I'll make sure to have everybody out by 1 or a few minutes before. Okay? So just stop me. So, so I think about ethics. A lot of people think ethics black or white, shades of gray, or orange and white. So, you have right and wrong. And in this case, of course, the shades of gray, that's just wrong. It's just wrong. Okay? I figure since I'm over here, it's just wrong. But in fact, most of the decisions that scientists make are range in a continuum of what most people would say would be best practices versus things that are not best or just wrong. Mm-hmm.
As a student who's just now coming into my beginning of what's going to be my research career,
right.
At what point does self-plagiarism, when does it become self-plagiarism? Like, for example, if I explored an idea for the first time in a classroom assignment, but it's just a paper for that classroom assignment, am I self-plagiarizing if I refine that idea later in a real publication?
No, that's actually not. That's in fact, that was, I have a diagram. It's the self-plagiarism network, right? And so if self-plagiarism would be, let's don't talk about coursework, right? We could talk about coursework, okay? If I wrote a paper for a course, and then I decided to actually take that entire paper because my professor said, wow, this is a great paper. You should publish this as a review paper. That'd be perfectly okay. It's okay because no one has seen your paper. Now, if your professor says, I want you to write a paper on X, and you thought, I wrote about X 5 years ago. That was a pretty good paper. I got an A. I'll just send it here. Yeah, that's not okay, right? I mean, that would be because of the expectation, right? And it's all about expectation. I'm really glad you brought this up because people who are reading the literature expect that what you're doing is, number one, new, number two, yours, right? And so the expectation of the faculty member is that it is yours and it is new, right? So it has to do with the reader's perspective. But if you send me a note, I'll send you this thing about kind of the rules of do's and don'ts of self-plagiarism or recycling. Okay, because if it's wrong, it's self-plagiarism. If it's okay, it's just recycling. Okay, so then there are these kind of gray zones, and most people would say these are not sanctionable. Okay, that is so for those other ones, if you have NIH money and NIH, Office of Research Integrity, if there's a finding by the university, it gets sent back to the ORI that you're guilty of falsification. Okay, what can happen? Okay, you can be disbarred from getting federal funds. Maybe your employer will take action. There are things that happen because of a finding. Okay, but then there are lots of things that are in this gray zone. Okay, like double publishing of figures and data. Okay, this is really real to me because I'm wrapping up a review paper. And we did use some published figures as kind of a model and the basis of some things that we did, right? And so we're citing these. I think in most instances we're citing the ones. If we're copying them, if they're really similar, then we're getting permission, right? So these things are important, but it's easy to screw up accidentally. Let me say that. Because there are some figures that I know I've seen before that we're doing something that's kind of similar. And it's almost like a bicycle wheel, all right? Identifying a bicycle wheel. It becomes hard to do, okay?
Sorry.
It's all right. Salami slicing. Anybody know what salami slicing is? Other than the case meat chopping? No. Salami slicing is you take a study and then some people think that the sheer number of papers that come from a study is most important, right? And so they'll slice that study up as thin as they can. And instead of publishing one really nice paper that's useful and gets cited a lot, they might publish 3 or 4 or 5 or whatever. They'll slice the salami too thin. It's actually not a great strategy because a lot of times these skinny little papers are really never used, read, or cited by anybody, okay? And now citations are getting to be more and more important as a research metric, right? Not just sheer number of papers, okay? Selective data reporting. Okay, this is a biggie because you have a big data set and you think, some of these data don't fit. I'm just going to get rid of some and just report on these data, right? Sometimes it might be a good decision. Sometimes it borders now on falsification, goes towards falsification. So this could actually be falsification. Misappropriating statistics or analyses. I mean, a lot of times the peer reviewers catch that and it gets fixed, sometimes not. You know, but this is a gray zone, right? About exactly, in this best science, you set up the experiment, you say how you're going to analyze the data, you collect the data, and then you do what you said you were going to do. Some people say, but my results are not statistically significant. So I'll use another statistical method. Okay. Mentorship failures, graduate students. Do we have any graduate students? No. So this probably doesn't apply to any. No. But this can happen. Conflicts of interest or bias. You know, this is another gray zone. If you're getting funding from a company, do you declare that? Where do you declare it? In what publications? This sort of thing. Authorship issues, ghost authorship and guest authorship. At least one university has basically declared these are a no-no. So ghost authorship is somebody writing the paper and putting your name on it. And this is kind of something where you're not really doing anything, and it's kind of like the guest authorship, okay? I have a Nobel Prize winning friend, and so I decided, well, people take my paper more seriously if I put his name on it. And so I call him up and say, hey, is this okay? Or I just do it. So I have one paper that just magically appeared, although I'm not the Nobel Prize winner, it's just one paper, that kind of magically appeared without my knowing it, where I was an author, okay? And that's, I would say that's not the best practice, and a lot of journals don't want to do that. Institutional affiliation falsification. So if I decide that I thought it might be better if I, put Stanford, University, some affiliation there. So apparently this kind of thing happens. Anyway, what's most important in science is not who's right, but what's right. And what gets tangled up in this is that because numbers of papers and grants and citations and all that's important for my career, maybe I can boost my career by twisting things a little bit, right? Not that I would ever do that, of course. But no, I mean, everybody would think about doing this.
That's quite a comprehensive list, but I'm wondering if there's one that's missing, or your thought on one that's missing, which is peer review, using peer review of funding or literature to advance your career over your competitor.
Yeah.
I'm sure that never happens.
I think in my book it might be in the conflict of interest. Okay. Because if you're a peer reviewer of a journal, your job is to review the paper, not actually steal ideas from the paper. Reject the paper, not that this has ever happened, reject the paper, steal the ideas, and you do the same thing and publish the same paper. But, these things happen. So the real question here is misconduct getting worse, okay? And I'm guessing that you all might think that my answer is yes, just because why ask the question and give the presentation if it's not getting worse. But there are some. It might not be getting worse. Okay. Yeah. Is it recurring more frequently? Is research misconduct more frequent? Yeah, maybe. But maybe if we're hearing about it more, maybe it's just being detected more frequently. Maybe research misconduct's always happened and which is being detected, or it's being reported more frequently, okay? Or maybe we're just hearing about it more in the science news and the culture, okay? And this is certainly the case in Europe, and I'll tell you why in just a minute. Or maybe it's all the above. I don't know. I'm going to try to answer these, or at least give us an idea about some trends and kind of what's going on, to help us answer the questions, right? And most of this will be a series of vignettes. Well, so one of my friends, a professional ethicist, he says, he makes the case that we live in a culture of cheating. And I think that that's why I added the IRS here, because I figure everybody can relate to that. And these are all kind of case studies. Some of these I cover in the class. This guy was a cell biologist in Korea, Dr. Huang. He was actually a pretty famous cell biologist, and it ended up that he/his group fabricated some data and falsified. Okay, we'll look at her. This is a Dr. Goodwin at the University of Wisconsin. Her lab basically turned her in for cheating. Okay, so these are a couple cases that we study in the class. We're not studying A-Rod, of course. A-Rod's gotten Alex Rodriguez. He's received a ban from baseball because of a steroid performance-enhancing drug finding that he's appealing now. So he's still hitting home runs. He's up to 651 in counting, right? But there's good evidence that he might have cheated by getting a better body. This was ironically, the Minister of Education in Germany, okay? These days in Germany, well, okay, in Europe, in most of Europe, if you're a politician or hold a political office, you have a PhD. If you have a PhD, you wrote a dissertation, and your dissertation is probably searchable, and so now you could imagine if this was the case in the US, of course, it's almost kind of funny to think of our politicians as actually being highly educated. But if it were the case, you could imagine that if a Democrat was running for an office, the Republicans would have hired a plagiarism seeker, okay? And if you can find that this guy has, if your Democratic opponent has plagiarized, you would say plagiarism, cheater, you know, and this is what happened with the minister, the education minister in Germany. I believe they revoked her degree, and she was forced to resign. This has happened all over Europe for politicians who have plagiarized in their dissertations. Okay. And this, since I'm a country music guy and writing country music, this is Jason Aldean. Jason Aldean filed for divorce in April. And a lot of the reasons is because TMZ, the paparazzi, caught him with, it's not his wife, okay? So anyway, so this slide shows, you know, number one, that we are kind of in a culture of cheating. Number two, cheating is being, can be detected, especially by the paparazzi, for example, okay? In other aspects of the cheating. So I'll show you how this all applies to research misconduct, I hope. So Dr. Huang had a paper in, I think it was a paper in Science, yep. And what he did is he copied, or somebody in his lab copied, and he knew about it apparently, copied parts of images. He had made the big result that he could clone cell lines and actually, so it's basically a cloning finding, okay, able to clone, all right? So he made the finding is that he had a lot of clones, okay, when in reality he might have had one or two, but he He inflated the finding. Okay, he was fired from his institution. I guess he picked up another job in another Asian country. But he was a rock star scientist in Korea. Okay, this was a big guy. This guy, there were some other ethical things, like he had women, believe it or not, rock star. He had women lined up to donate eggs for his research. Okay, now this is an invasive procedure, right? So this is like, this is rock star stuff. And so he kind of got in trouble on the bioethics side too. So one of the things that I talk about in the course and teach in the course is, for example, rules for changing images. Okay, and so I tell the students, okay, back in the old days, we would use Polaroids to take pictures of our gels. We might chop off some of the ugly parts with scissors or whatever, but then we published basically what we had because we couldn't do anything else. Okay, now you can do lots of stuff. Okay, and I'll start here. And this is one warning is beware of over beautification, because now the journal editors, journal reviewers, and even the scientists themselves all want pretty data. Okay, they do. They want pretty data, and you can make them very pretty. Okay, but anyway, so it's don't combine images unless it's clear they were combined. Manipulation should be done into the entire image, not just a part. Of course, Huang's paper, where they actually cut off part and used it in some other place. I mean, that's kind of going beyond. But these are things that unless you really think about, maybe you could do these things accidentally, right? Because you want the pretty picture. But there should never be an intent to deceive. And so in the class, we go over case studies along with some foundational material, basically to help students to think about research integrity in the age of digital manipulation. Okay, and that's a really important take-home point for young scientists, old scientists too. Okay, so now to the meat of it. Is there more research? Is there more research misconduct happening now? Is it being reported more, or what's actually happening? And so once again, Gary Comstock basically got these data from his own Office of Research, of his own Office of Research. They're estimating that less than 1% of research misconduct is reported. Okay, less than 1%. And you could think about your own laboratory experiences, how and when you would actually report something. Okay, people don't want to report things, especially research misconduct. And as we'll see with the other vignette here, because maybe your future can be affected by it, right? So less than 1% is reported, yet the Journal of Cell Biology estimates that about 20% of papers, at least in the area of cell biology, contain questionable data. So what does questionable mean? It could mean falsified, fabricated, or maybe some of these other things that we talked about in the previous slide. Data that are manipulated to show something that might not be exactly how it was in the laboratory. Okay? So is there underreporting? I mean, there's probably a lot of underreporting. Is more being reported now? Maybe. And here's a case. This is very, very recent. And so what happened is that, so this is the title slide. If you don't have the data, just make it up, because you're not going to be able to read this. But basically, this is part of a chemistry paper. This was a paper that was published in one of the American Chemical Society journals. And for whatever reason, a note from the boss to the student says, Emma, please insert NMR data here, here. where are they? And for this compound, just make up an elemental analysis, okay? So it's like, we know it exists, we know it's there, we have to get this through peer review, just make it up. So here's an instance where the boss is telling the student, don't worry, it's just a little detail, just make it up. Anyway, so this comment somehow ended up in the draft that was published online. Oops. So this is like the worst kind of interpretation, just make up the data. It might be, she was telling, they were telling them, we'll do the experiment and insert it. All right. But I add that one here, there just before this one, because this was a kind of a nice study that was done in 2005. This was a survey. I've cut off the title. It's Scientists Behaving Badly. If you want to look it up, it was published in Nature in 2005. And it's a short paper, and what they did is they surveyed postdoctoral associates who were recipients of NIH postdoc awards. So these are good, these are good scientists, postdocs, right? Being able to win these NIH postdoc fellowships. And they also surveyed scientists that were a little bit more advanced in their careers. These, I think, were associate professors. They're calling mid-career and early career, okay? So the mid-career and early career, and they asked these questions, and the questions were, have you done any of these things in the last 3 years? And you see the sample size, pretty big sample size, 3,000 in some. And so, number one, you can see these numbers here, the self-reporting numbers of falsifying or cooking research data. So this is 0.3%, so 3 out of 1,000. 3 out of 1,000, falsification. Ignoring aspects of human subject requirements. That's a bioethical concern, maybe not one that's conducive to all research ethics, but that's a big deal. Not properly disclosing involvement in firms whose products are being based on one's own research. Remember, this is NIH, so it is biomedical, right? So that can be important. But then look at some of these. Using another's ideas without obtaining permission or due credit. So now it's 1.4, 1.7%. Unauthorized confidential information. Okay, so this is this idea where you're reviewing a paper, peer review, you're supposed to not use it and say, whoa, hey, great idea, I'll do that. Failing to present data that contradicts one's own previous research. Now this is a killer one, right? Because you have to have a certain amount of humility to do that. Or at least me being right is more important than what's right at this point. But look at these numbers, on the 6%, 6.5%. Overlooking others' use of flawed data. So this is the non-reporting issue, right? This is overlooking others' use of flawed data. 12.5, 12.2%. The thing that I want you to see here is that, and there's some other things, withholding details of methodology, and that's important. This is inappropriately assigning authorship credit, the mentorship authorship thing, right? So these are pretty big numbers. So what I want you to see is that for the early career, for these that are statistically different, the mid-career, the older scientist, is doing the bad stuff more frequently than the early career scientists, okay? 20.6, for example, is changing design methodology or results of a study in response to pressure from a funding source more so than the early career, double, right? So as it's kind of sad to say, but as the older I get, the worse I behave.
This data that we're looking at here, these are a single point in time. It's not a longitudinal study. This is looking at
It's not.
Scientists from different points in time in their career.
No. Yeah, so these are two different populations.
Okay.
Postdocs and mid-career associate professors.
Is it possible that some of the differences that we're seeing could be due to the fact that early career scientists have
For sure,
simply
yeah.
because, you know,
So,
they don't have the power to do that.
yeah, for this one, maybe so. Yeah, maybe so, right? I would like to think that they've taken my class and they're behaving better, right? These guys never had my class because they're too old. But no, you're exactly right. For some of these, yes, you could certainly say that there are different pressures or opportunities for older scientists than it would be for younger scientists.
And how would you describe or define the line between recognizing that maybe funding agencies do have some obligation to set a scientific research agenda without them crossing a line
Yeah.
into, you know, we just don't like the research results. We want them to do something different.
Right. And this is probably the most controversial of these items because it can be interpreted in many different ways. If it's results, most people say, oh, that's just wrong. That should have been its own item, right? But if I submit a grant proposal to the USDA and I ask for $500,000 and they give me $250,000 and they say, lop off some of the objectives, I say, okay. Would I answer yes to this? Well, maybe. Maybe, yeah. So this one is the most controversial. So you picked you did pick a good one to focus on to really see if these data are, you think these are valid, right? But most of the other ones, it does point that scientists get more savvy about what they can get away with, and I'm going to say that. The other piece of evidence, the big piece of evidence that there is more misconduct is that there's a big rise in retractions. So there is a group, I'll show up, give attribution to them in a few minutes, called Retraction Watch, a couple science journalists who started Retraction Watch. Now, not all papers that are retracted because of misconduct. Some of them can be retracted because of honest error, okay? All things being equal, this is still, it's not a great sign. For the editorial, the papers where I've been involved in the as an editor that have been retracted, they've been misconduct. It's not honest error. Okay. But this is a huge increase, right? I mean, look, 0.005%, versus basically a tenfold increase. Once again, is it more misconduct, or are people more aware that there could be problems, or is more being reported? It's hard to say, okay? I'll talk for just a minute about the Wisconsin whistleblower case because, number one, there aren't many well-known whistleblower cases where the faculty member here is turned in by her laboratory, okay? In this case, she wrote a grant proposal and it contained a gel figure from a paper that was being published, and she basically changed the caption and made it about another protein, okay? She ended up talking with a postdoc in the lab. She might have been a technician, but a postdoc, kind of a senior person in the lab. This person was concerned enough that she talked with another person in the lab, another PhD student, I think, and from there they had a lab meeting, and they said, well, this is kind of bothersome, and then they reasoned it all out, and they said, well, if we turn her in, she's not going to like it. What if we're wrong, right? It's going to be bad for us. So Mary Allen was the student who basically said, no, what she did was wrong. Whether it's going to be good for us or bad for us, I think I'm going to turn her in. And this is all kind of, how it played out. And finally, they all agreed, okay, if you're going to go, we're going to go, we're all in together. And so they turned her in, she resigned, and when she resigned, the University of Wisconsin, apparently the dean department head, somebody in administration said, you did the right thing, don't worry, we'll take care of you, okay? Which was kind of temporary because as it is in the university, these people were now toxic. They were viewed basically as toxic. Nobody wanted to mentor these people, okay? So they all left. They all left. I think the only one who finished her degree was Mary Allen, and she finished it someplace else. So whistleblowing within the university, and so this goes back to the reporting thing, is very, very difficult, okay? Even with whistleblower protection, since students are basically apprentices, once the boss is gone, the student is also gone pretty much, okay? Especially when they turn in the boss. I add this vignette. Once again, these are all, the Mary Allen case and Goodwin case is kind of old. This is a 2013 case. This is something that kind of blew up. This guy has retracted 54 papers. He's a Danish psychologist, Dietrich Stapel, okay? And the thing that I really like, this came out of Retraction Watch, the Retraction Watch website. The thing that I really find interesting about this one is that he's now gone on to TED to talk about what happened to him. 54 papers, and basically what happened is he just made up the data. So this is all data fabrication, right? He just made it up. And he says, among other things, he says, he lost his moral compass, but now it's back. So hire me, I'm a nice guy, kind of thing. Maybe, I don't know. I have not seen the talk, but this will be interesting. And so, is there, this is kind of the society that we live in, right? On my culture of cheating thing, I used to have, it is football season, but it's old news. The former Arkansas football coach, right? You guys know the story there. He was cheating on his wife. He got on a motorcycle wreck. The girl he was cheating with was on the back. And then he lied to the athletic director and he got fired. Not so much for cheating, but for lying, and mainly because the Razorback fans might be upset. And, you know, so the thing is, but he's now got a job at our next football opponent, Western Kentucky. So he's now the Western Kentucky football coach, and so we'll see him. Probably sans girlfriend. I think that's pretty much done. So why would there be more cheating today than 10 years ago, 20 years ago? And I'm not saying that there is more research misconduct. I think there might be. And if there is, these are the reasons that I've heard where people who might be mostly honest and upright and good scientists might shade towards doing things that are not the best practices. How's that for a politically good way to say this, right? One is, of course, we live in a publish and perish culture in the university. If I'm going to get tenure, I should have publications. Not only publications, but publications in the right journals. They get cited a lot. They got to be good studies, right? They got to be good studies. And here's what your bosses will tell you now, because I tell my own students this. They have to tell a good story. You've got to tell a good story. Well, how do you tell a good story? Well, one way is to just make up the story. Okay. But there's the publish and perish. And related to this is the grant competition. The grant competition is fierce. The grant, I was telling the guys, one of my grants just recently got rejected. And it was like, they funded 6, they had 89 proposals or so, okay? So how do you get the edge? Well, one way could be what Dr. Goodwin did at the University of Wisconsin, is you help tell a good story, even though maybe the story's not all there. There are emerging players in international science, okay? And this is creating some stress amongst scientists. So for example, in many Chinese universities, you have to publish your paper in an international journal with a certain impact factor. So it has to be, you know, pretty good journal, right? Or you don't graduate. And we don't have these kinds of institutional rules here in the US. But they do in a lot of places in China. And I think in some other countries, they're saying, hey, you've got to do this. You're not going to advance in your career unless you do this. Okay, and that creates pressure. There's also pressure for funding. Okay, one country is trying to build a science culture. I won't talk about this country, but this country is trying to build a science culture, and they're putting a lot of money into grants, and they're funding about 3/4 of the proposals, right? So in the US, USDA anyway, NSF, they're funding 10 to 20%. Well, they're funding like 2/3 of these proposals, all right? And so all you got to do is write something and you almost get it funded. And so these are things that haven't happened in some countries before. So there is this pressure to perform. And then there's this, what I term as the thin line of decisions. Do I do it, the best practices, or do I fudge a little bit? I mean, it's not a big deal. Am I going to do it? And then you can fudge a little bit more. I mean, you know, you could think about any area of your life where there's a temptation to cheat. This is how it works, right? Just think about the IRS. Okay, all right. Tax return. All right. Well, I'm going to wrap up here. I like to always talk about this story. This is Frank Abagnale became a master shyster. He became a physician. He became an airline pilot. He did all these things without any, without any training. He just did it. He's a very sharp guy, no doubt. Made a movie. So here he is, Leonardo DiCaprio. But he said, this is at the back of his book, he says, we don't teach ethics at home, we don't teach ethics at school because a teacher would be accused of teaching morality. So what is ethics? Ethics is applied morality, basically. Research ethics is applying some sort of morality to the practices of doing science. So yeah, okay, so am I teaching morality? Yeah, okay, maybe so. But we have to look at the long and hard to even find a college course on ethics. And so, you know, we do have a college course on ethics, and there are some other ones at UT. So with that, I'll kind of wrap up here and try to guess at some answers. Is misconduct getting worse? Is it occurring more frequently? I think probably so. It is occurring more frequently, at least worldwide, because of pressures to perform. New players in science who may not have thought about this. I mean, even my own student, remember, even my own student, he really hadn't thought about ethics, and I hadn't thought about ethics, research ethics, and misconduct. I mean, you know, so I think understanding the rules of science and teaching this is important, okay? Is it detected more frequently? Of course. Now when I submit a paper to certain journals, I know they're going to do plagiarism. They're going to run it through plagiarism checker. So what do? I run it through a plagiarism checker first to make sure that none of my students plagiarized anything, okay? Same thing for image analysis. It's getting easier to detect images that have been manipulated, okay? So once again, I've got a lab of like 40 people now, like 40 full-time people. I'm thinking that's too many. I'm not a micromanager, but I can't keep up with it all, right? I try, and so I'm using tools. All my lab meetings, I talk about it, research ethics. I talk about right and wrong, and I say you're gonna get cooked if you do it wrong. So we do image analysis, we do plagiarism checking. So we do have these defensive maneuvers that we hope influence behavior. Okay. Is it being reported more frequently? maybe, maybe not. It's hard to say. There are no rewards for reporting bad behavior. None. There are no rewards in science. None. Is it more apparent in the news culture? Yes, I think people are thinking about it more, and certainly these big science studies that end up being false create news. They do create news. So is it all the above? Well, you know, maybe half, 3 out of 4. But it's a problem that we're going to have to live with, I think. I don't think we're actually going to get rid of research misconduct, but we can mitigate and manage it and hopefully educate against it. And that's the job of every scientist.